This episode contains graphic depictions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. It's a week before Christmas. I'm at a bar called 97 Astoria, just east of downtown Atlanta. 97 Astoria, it's a bit like a dive bar, situated right between two classic Atlanta neighborhoods, Reynoldstown and Cabbagetown. Cabbagetown, if you remember, is where I live, inside that old cotton mill. Reynoldstown is one neighborhood over. This bar I'm at sits roughly on the dividing line between the two neighborhoods. When I first moved to Cabbagetown, a bunch of locals told me that 97 Astoria was a cocaine bar. I have no idea what that means. Maybe you buy cocaine from some guy. I'm not really sure. To us, it's just your typical neighborhood bar with neon beer signs and a cool patio. But tonight, no one's on the patio. It's too cold, and the bar is pretty much packed. There's a live band playing jazzed-up renditions of Christmas songs and a comedy show later. It's a 5-person band fronted by a young black woman in a festive green dress and her sidekick, a white guy wearing a preppy blue sweater sitting at a keyboard. He's giving off, like, Broadway show tunes vibes. This bar is usually pretty grimy, but not tonight. It's all dressed up for the holidays. The smoky, dimly lit lounge vibe has been livened up with multicolored Christmas lights strung along the ceiling. The whole place has a red glow, and a small disco ball is scattering tiny red and green shimmers all over the floor and walls. Crumpled cans of PBR dangle from the rafters like redneck Christmas ornaments. My husband and I are sitting at the bar with a few friends. He orders a Pacifico beer, and I get a tequila soda. I notice behind the bar a sign that says in big black letters, "No racism, no ableism, no homophobia, no transphobia, no xenophobia." Sitting on the other side of the bar, there's a black guy wearing like an open-faced Santa outfit, because you can see an Atlanta Hawks jersey underneath. It's like a chill party with a bunch of friends in someone's basement. People watching the band, talking, laughing at their tables. Everyone's sipping something, everyone's smiling. CNN is on the TV behind me. Some kind of political drama is playing out, but nobody cares. From my perch on my bar stool, I look out over the crowd. Lots of white faces, lots of black faces. It's a good mix of both. Shockingly, this is a bit rare in Atlanta. A lot of restaurants and bars here either draw a mostly white crowd or mostly black crowd. But not tonight. Not here. It's a packed room and a diverse room. I always love places like this in Atlanta. It just feels right. I've been swimming in Atlanta history lately, so I wonder if anyone in this room knows the history of the ground we're standing on. I wonder if they know we're sitting between two neighborhoods that were like polar opposites for 100 years. I wonder if they know that Reynoldstown was one of Atlanta's first settled black communities. After the rail lines were blown up during the Civil War, the city needed people to rebuild them. The cheapest labor around was newly freed slaves, so they all settled into the area we now know as Reynoldstown, which sits right next to those rail lines. On the other side, Cabbagetown. I wonder how many people here know its history, that it was a neighborhood built for cotton mill workers in the late 1800s. Rural mountain people from up north moved down to Atlanta to work in that mill. For 100 years, Cabbagetown was this rustic Appalachian mountain community in the middle of downtown Atlanta. And I wonder if anyone in this bar knew about the race troubles that used to plague these two communities. How white Cabbagetowners wouldn't step a toe into black Reynoldstown, and how black Reynoldstown residents wouldn't dare cross into the all-white Cabbagetown after dark. For 100 years, there was an invisible wall keeping these two neighborhoods apart, one side black and the other side white. Atlanta is filled with these invisible walls. One wall that's not invisible is the facade of Krog Tunnel. I can see it through the window, sitting from my bar stool in this bar as Christmas music continues to play. Krog Tunnel was dug underneath that massive rail yard next to Reynoldstown. Thousands of cars pass through it every day. The tunnel itself is covered in graffiti, street art, and murals. From where I'm sitting, I can see spray painted near the top of the tunnel the phrase, "Locals Only." Except locals has been crossed out and the word posers written above it. A not so subtle swipe at all the new gentrifiers in the neighborhood. But if you look just underneath the posers line, you'll see something else. A number, chiseled into the tunnel's concrete face to mark the year it was built. That year? 1912. The same year a county just north of here exploded with racial terror. I wonder if anyone here knows that story. You're listening to episode 12 of CATLICK, State of Insurrection. Okay, let's recap. When I last left you, we were in Forsyth County, 40 miles north of Atlanta. Ellen Grice claimed she was assaulted in the night by a black man. 5 men were taken into custody. There was nearly a riot until the state militia came in and restored peace, and for their own safety, the prisoners were transported to Atlanta. The next day, a woman named May Crow went missing in the Forsyth County countryside. Men searched through the night and sadly found her lying prostrate on a lonely dirt road, beaten, bleeding, and barely conscious. When I first discovered how May Crow had been assaulted, head wound, and cut throat, I thought, oh my gosh, maybe the Atlanta Ripper got her too. The way she was assaulted was similar, but the similarities pretty much end there. I mean, it's possible, but highly unlikely she was a Ripper victim. So who was behind this terrible assault? Well, on September the 9th, 1912, no one in Forsyth County was sitting on their hands waiting to find out. The hunt had begun. As word begins to spread about the assault of 18-year-old May Crow, a crowd gathers around the scene of the crime. Farmers, law enforcement, and even a few Atlanta reporters who'd been tipped off. Back then, pretty much everyone felt like they were an investigator. Across the street from the commotion, a couple of black teen boys are lying in the grass in front of Pleasant Grove Church, watching the buzzing crime scene. Keep in mind, at this point, we're way out in the country, like miles from the town of Cumming where all the drama had happened the weekend before. Communication was limited, so there's a good chance these boys had no idea the bigger context of what had been going on. Based off eyewitness reports, we know that one of the white men walked across the street and approached the group of black boys. He'd apparently found a small mirror near the spot where May Crow was found. He asks the boys if it belonged to any of them. 16-year-old Ernest Knox raised his hand and said, "Yeah, it's mine." "Come with me," says the older white gentleman, who would later be referred to as a leading citizen of the county. The man ushers young Ernest Knox to his car, pushes him into the back seat, and they drive away. Less than half an hour later, the man returns, declaring that he'd found the perpetrator who'd attacked May Crow. On their drive, he claimed Ernest Knox had confessed. Now, this is where things take a very shady turn. In the 1980s, some people from Forsyth County were interviewed about all the drama that went down during this time. It was in one of those interviews where an elderly white lady came clean with what happened to Ernest Knox during that ride through the countryside with that leading citizen. Ruth Jordan testified that after getting out of sight of the crowd, the man pulled over and interrogated Ernest Knox. And then, this man took a rope from the back of his car, wrapped it around the teen's neck, and began strangling him. Students of American history know there's a name for this: mock lynching. It was a form of torture sometimes used during the Jim Crow era, designed to get black people to confess to crimes they may or may not have committed. The tactic is pretty simple. Start choking someone and ask them if they committed the crime at hand. If they say no, just tighten the noose. Ask them again, tighten again. Think of it like old school waterboarding, but way worse in my opinion. As the victim realizes he's about to die, well, self-preservation kicks in. Of course he confesses. And in the lynching era, that's all you need, a confession, to greenlight the mob. So, after this man gets his confession, he shoves a terrified Ernest Knox back into his car and returns to the group of men gathered at the crime scene. He gets to feel like a community hero, proudly announcing his prisoner's confession. By that afternoon, the papers in Atlanta declared that a black brute in Forsyth County had confessed to everything. Police on site decide it's best to take 16-year-old Ernest Knox not to the jail in Cumming, but to Gainesville, next door in Hall County. They put him in the fastest car they have, knowing he'd be chased the whole way by a caravan of horses and buggies. And that's exactly what happened. Once Knox is inside the Gainesville jail, a local official realizes the potential for violence and a call is made to Atlanta. Within minutes, Ernest Knox is escorted out the back door and into a waiting car, where he's whisked away before the gathering mob can give chase. After a 3-hour ride over bumpy roads, they arrive at the infamous jail in downtown Atlanta, where Ernest Knox would be booked into the urban fortress known as the Fulton Tower, a structure designed to keep out the lynch mobs that had plagued Georgia for decades. It's worth noting here that as Ernest Knox fell asleep that first night in his dank cell deep in the Fulton Tower, he was likely near other black men being held for the Atlanta Ripper murders. So, who was Ernest Knox, and was he the person that attacked May Crow? Well, thanks to the work of author Patrick Phillips, we know a little bit about Ernest Knox's family history and past. By the way, throughout this story, I'm drawing heavily on Phillips' incredible book, Blood at the Root, and I'd highly recommend you pick up a copy for yourself. Vault subscribers, I've linked to it inside this episode's artifact page. We know that Ernest Knox was one of 3 children. We know his mother Nettie was widowed at the age of 21 with 3 young kids. And we know that at some point during Ernest's childhood, his mother died, leaving the 3 Knox children parentless and homeless in a rural area where everyone around them was also struggling to survive. One Forsyth local recounted seeing the 3 Knox kids crouching near a chicken coop on a cold winter night. They'd been foraging for food and were roasting worms over a little fire. It's tough to comprehend the level of poverty and near starvation Ernest Knox endured as a child. He was an illiterate kid with no home, no parents, and no possessions, wandering the fields of Forsyth County, foraging and begging for food. We do know that when he got older, Ernest did some field work for a landowner in Forsyth. I can't imagine what was going through his mind on the day he was put into an automobile and driven to the big city of Atlanta. He'd likely never left Forsyth County, so he must have felt like he was entering another world when the car began to weave in and out of the bustling streets and skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. Away from all that was familiar to him, I imagine he was very, very scared. It's all really sad to think about. Regarding his guilt or innocence, it's highly unlikely Ernest Knox had anything to do with May Crow's attack. Consider this. The only alleged piece of evidence we know of is that a mirror he owned was found near the scene of the crime. Not real convincing. Next, we don't have any indication that Ernest Knox had a troubled or violent past. Also, if you just brutally attacked a woman, why would you just be hanging out with your buddies on the church lawn, literally across the street from the crime scene, in a racist and hostile community where black people were outnumbered 10 to 1 and frequently accused of crimes? It doesn't make sense. And finally, we know that his confession was coaxed out of him from this mock lynching at the hands of some older, wealthy white man. It's all so shady, it hurts. Okay, to recap our timeline, Mae Crow went missing on a Sunday. On Monday, her body was found and Ernest Knox was arrested and taken to the jail in Atlanta. Now, on Tuesday morning, Forsyth County Sheriff William Reed and his deputy, Gay Lummis, saddle their horses and head out to Oscarville to continue their investigation of the beating of Mae Crow. After Ernest Knox was whisked away to Gainesville, there was speculation that he wasn't alone in his wicked deeds. Therefore, justice still needed to be served. When they arrived in Oscarville, the two law officers learned that some white men had detained a local field hand, a guy named Rob Edwards, just known locally as Big Rob. He'd been implicated in the attack because he was spotted hanging out with Ernest Knox the day before. We don't know a lot about Big Rob other than he was apparently a pretty big, strapping guy and was about 24 years old. Reed and Lummis take Edwards into custody and begin the several-mile journey back into the county seat town of Cumming. Unsurprisingly, they're followed the whole way. As they galloped through the paths and unpaved roads of the North Georgia countryside, the train of enraged county residents grew behind them. When they finally arrive at the Cumming Town Square, they dash into the jailhouse and lock up Rob Edwards in the most secure, iron-barred cell they had. The entourage of rage arrived at the jail just minutes later. But they were just the tip of the spear. It quickly became known that one of Mae Crow's attackers had been taken to the Forsyth County Jail. Like before, people from the outlying communities began to stream into the Cumming Town Square. These were the same men outraged over the attack of Ellen Grice. The same men who hissed at the Georgia militiamen in their fancy uniforms and shiny cars. The same men I told you who wanted war, who wanted blood. Newspapers reported that the crowd swelled to as many as 2,000, many of them armed for what was to come. The hostility outside the jail was reaching a boiling point. But this time, the cavalry was not on the way. From within the jail, Sheriff William Reed can hear the shouting and chanting. He can hear the dull thud of fists pounding on the front door, shaking dust off its wooden frame. And he knows he's got to make an impossible decision. He has two choices. Number one, enforce the rule of law and man up to the mob. Draw guns and command them to go home. And if he did this, one of two things would pretty much happen. The crazed mob kills him on the spot, or he pisses off 2,000 white men, a.k.a. the only people who can vote when he runs to be reelected as sheriff. This is obviously lose-lose. The second option? Capitulate to the mob. Step aside and let them have their way with Rob Edwards. This, of course, would be a massive stain on Cummings' reputation and put him in hot water with the governor's office, possibly even landing him in jail. So what did the highest-ranking law officer in Forsyth County do? Well, he turns to his young deputy, Gay Lummis, hands him the keys to the jail, and leaves. He opens the back door and just walks home. Now, it's no mystery that this was a cold and calculated move by Sheriff William Reed. He saw the writing on the wall. Think about it. By quietly walking away from this powder keg moment, he could maintain plausible deniability. When the governor asks him what happened, he could honestly say, "I don't know, boss. I was at home with my family. I left my right-hand man in charge and he just let me down." And at the same time, he could throw his political rival, Gay Lummis, under the bus. He would be the one to have to stand up to the mob, which would mean at best being hated by them, and at worst, being killed. It's also important to point out here something that would happen nearly a decade later. In the 1920s, with the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, a local chapter of the KKK sprung up in Forsyth County near Shawnee Mountain. 100 or so founding members scrawled their names on the charter, and among them, the signed name of William W. Reed. By law, Reed was required to oppose this hillbilly mob clamoring for black blood, but truth be told, he probably wished he was one of them. As the mob's fury grew, sadly, tragically, you can imagine what happened next. This wasn't the first lynch mob in Forsyth County. There are records of lynchings in Forsyth as far back as 1862, and it happened many times since then. Phillips has a sobering observation on this dark moment. These earlier lynchings suggest that rather than yielding to a sudden, irresistible passion, as lynchings were usually portrayed, the men pounding on the door of the coming jail were taking part in a time-honored ritual. Many would have heard tales of past lynchings from their fathers and grandfathers, and when Rob Edwards was arrested on suspicion of rape, they saw their chance to finally join that grand tradition, to show that they too were men of honor and no less committed to the defense of white womanhood. And this was their moment to do exactly that. With Reed now gone, Lummis mounted a respectable stand. There are reports that he attempted to reason with the outraged mob, shouting negotiations through the jail's bolted front door. But the more he reasoned, the more they raged. In a flash, a sledgehammer came smashing through the wooden door frame. Then another blow, and then another. Lummis stumbled backwards as splinters of wood rained down, skipping off the jailhouse floor. Within seconds, the door gave way, and a crush of wild-eyed maniacs in overalls let out a war cry as they flooded into the jail. Lummis was easily pushed aside as the men began hunting their target. In the back cell of the jail, they found him, a terrified and bewildered Big Rob Edwards. Moments later, the mob emerged from the jail with their prisoner, their villain. A victory cheer goes up from the crowd. From here, I'll let the eyewitness report from a reporter with the Atlanta Georgian tell you what happened next. Out in the sunshine came the Negro, gray in his terror, his eyes rolling in abject fear, muttering prayers and supplications to the mob. But these were soon drowned in the rain of blows which fell upon him. A rope was brought from a nearby store and a noose dropped around the Negro's neck. The mob was fighting for a chance to get at its victim. Across the street and up to the public square hurried the mob, its victim at the fore. The Negro had lost his feet and was being dragged by the rope, his body bumping over the stones. At the corner of the square, a telephone post and its cross-arm offered a convenient gallows. The end of the rope was tossed over the arm. A dozen hands grasped it, and the Negro, perhaps already dead, was drawn high into the air. Rob Edwards had been beaten to death and then lynched on the crossbar of a telephone pole in broad daylight, with 2,000 people either participating, encouraging, or watching. Once he was hoisted high above the crowd, the guns came out. Rifles, revolvers, and old muskets pointed skyward, carefully trained on the lifeless body of Rob Edwards. The firing began. Round after round entered the body of 24-year-old Edwards. The crackle of gunshots, the celebratory howls of the men, and the pungent smell of gunpowder rose high into the blue skies of North Georgia. One witness noted that when they were finished, Rob Edwards' body was, quote, mangled into something hardly resembling a human form. These men had wanted blood, and they'd finally gotten it. Today, we know that between 1880 and 1930, as many as 550 people were killed in Georgia in these types of illegal acts of mob violence. Again, that's just in Georgia. There are no photos of the sickening scene of Rob Edwards' lynching. But I've seen other photos from similar days with similar characters. Just a year before this, a black guy named Charlie Hale was lynched in the nearby town of Lawrenceville. There's a chilling photo of a young black man dressed in overalls, noose around his neck, hanging from a telephone pole. Behind him, a dozen or so white men looking directly into the camera, blank stares and a smirk or two. Beneath the men are 3 bloodhounds, tongues out, still panting. And most disturbingly, there's a handwritten sign dangling off the toe of Charlie Hale. Written in black, "Do not wake." Murder, with a side of sarcasm. It's weird to me that when you say the word terrorist, what flashes through most American minds is the image of a brown-skinned Middle Eastern man. And when you say the word gang, most Americans would probably picture a group of black guys in LA, all wearing bandanas. Yet, no one imagines their great-grandfather as a terrorist. No one imagines white men in overalls eating cornbread and drinking a Coke. These were the original terrorists, the original gangs. Homegrown and living in the house next door. Now, they didn't teach me that in school either. Oftentimes, looking at history feels like looking at the sun. It's uncomfortable, maybe even painful, and our instinct is to flinch and look away. But unlike gazing at the sun, we need to look at history. It helps us see our world today way more clearly. Thanks for looking with me. Don't go away. After having publicly executed Rob Edwards, the bloodlust of the mob was satisfied, and all these guys quietly walked home and had dinners with their families. Nah, the opposite happened, actually. The campaign of vigilante justice had just begun. The men made quick plans to drive west to the town of Marietta, where the remaining black suspects of Forsyth County were being harbored. Remember, 5 black men were arrested in connection with the first attack, the one on Ellen Grice. After the state militia came to the rescue, those men were escorted to the Marietta jail in neighboring Cobb County. The journey to Marietta wasn't a short one, a couple of hours at least. A call is made to officials in Marietta, warning them of the coming mob. The sheriff in Marietta then makes a call to the Fulton Tower down in Atlanta, explains the situation, and asks if they've got room. They say, "Yeah, we'll take them." So before the gang of men can even get there, the 5 prisoners are put into a few cars and transported down to Atlanta, where they would join the other Forsyth County prisoners. Back in Cumming, as the sun begins to set, someone scales the telephone pole, holding the remains of Rob Edwards, and cuts the rope. His body falls to the ground in a heap and lays there overnight, untouched. A gory and ominous warning to any black resident of Forsyth County who dare step out of line. As morning breaks on the next day, the county coroner shows up to collect the corpse, now lying in the middle of the Cumming town square. Despite hundreds of witnesses to this outburst of violence, despite some of Cumming's most recognizable citizens joining in the violence with those who'd come in from the hills, the coroner wrote on his official report that Rob Edwards was killed by, quote, "parties unknown." In the days that followed, papers around the state reported on the sensational drama out of Forsyth County. Virtually all of them commiserated with the white mob. The general theme was basically, listen, these are good people who were provoked. They only did what had to be done. And one paper even praised the mob for showing, quote, "remarkable restraint." Sheriff William Reed also reemerged into the public eye after going AWOL the day before. Reporters around the state wanted a statement, and he was eager to supply it. In talking to the journalists, he made it clear that overwhelming fear had invaded Forsyth County. Not the fear of black people towards bloodthirsty lynch mobs, but of the innocent and bedraggled white community now haunted by the fear of being murdered in the night by bands of black savages. And no, he wasn't present when the county jail was stormed, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway, he assured reporters. A direct quote from the Atlanta Georgian by William Reed. Of course, it would have been all the same if I had been there. Even though I do carry about a lot of flesh and muscle, I would have been like a straw in the whirlwind against that crowd. Sheriff William Reed, folks. In all my historical research, I've come across some truly terrible humans, but I've got to say, William Reed may be the most loathsome and despicable of them all. And honestly, you haven't even heard the worst of it yet. Ernest Knox was behind bars and Rob Edwards had been lynched. But neither of these events slowed the work of the Forsyth police. They were hell-bent on finding every remaining black soul who'd abetted the assault on May Crow. That day, they arrested 3 more people: Ed Collins, Jane Daniel, and Oscar Daniel. Jane and Oscar were siblings. Also, Jane was the wife of Big Rob Edwards, who'd just been killed in Cumming. Fearing the worst, Mayor Charlie Harris makes arrangements for this newest batch of prisoners. By the time word got around, the 3 suspects were already behind bars, but not in Cumming, in Atlanta. That meant there were now 11 black Forsyth County residents imprisoned in the ATL. Now, this all happened on September the 11th, and in the weeks that followed, headlines of the race troubles in Forsyth began to fade. Life began to return to normal. That was until late September. For 2 weeks, May Crow had been in a coma at her home way out in the tiny community of Oscarville. Despite her bedridden state, she'd become somewhat of a celebrity, with various local admirers showing up on the Crow doorstep hoping to see her. However, all that stopped on September 23rd. That was the day May Crow's parents announced that their daughter, just 18 years old, had succumbed to her injuries and passed away. In the days after May Crow's body was lowered into the North Georgia soil, something changed. The grief turned into rage, and the rage catalyzed. The rage got organized. Secretive meetings were held, maps were drawn, materials were purchased, and a plan was agreed upon. To this day, we're not exactly sure who was behind it, but we know a dark plan was hatched. A plan designed to stalk, terrorize, and expel the black residents of Forsyth County. Not just some, not just those perceived to be troublemakers. No. This was a systematic campaign to purge all African Americans from Forsyth County soil. And they wouldn't stop till Forsyth County was an all-white county. The weeks that followed May Crow's death were inconceivably wicked. One resident simply described it by saying, quote, "All hell broke loose." The strategy set into motion relied upon the terror tactics of midnight vigilantes. Though back then they were more commonly referred to as night riders. For decades, newspapers in Georgia had published reports of mysterious night riders and their moonlit raids of terror. In a nutshell, night riders were gangs of white men on horseback, heavily armed with knives, guns, torches, explosives, kerosene, and more. They were often masked and operated at night to maintain their anonymity. Night after night, these domestic terrorists chased, harassed, and sometimes murdered the black residents of Forsyth County. In the middle of the night, terrified black families would wake, look out the windows of their cabins, and see masked men on horses brandishing torches. It's terrifying when you think about it. The men would often spray the homes with gunfire. The families would then flee into the nearby woods as bullets, catcalls, and racial slurs were sent flying in their direction. There was one report of a home so shot up that the, quote, legs of all the tables and chairs had been shot off, end quote. Once vacated, men would often enter the homes, douse the floorboards with kerosene, and strike a match, illuminating the night sky with a massive blaze that could be seen for miles around. Arson was perhaps the most effective tool of terror these men used. During this time, the Augusta Chronicle reported that several Negro cabins and churches had been burned in the night. While the burning of cabins made black families instantly homeless, the loss of churches was particularly devastating. In these communities, black churches were the centers of social, spiritual, and civic life. They held the community together while providing essential services for these rural families dealing with the day-to-day struggle for survival. The little infrastructure that actually existed for the black community was systematically torched. Night after night, these raids continued. Throughout September, once the sun went down, residents of Forsyth County fell asleep to the sound of galloping horses, gunshots, explosions, and screams. By any standard, there was a war being waged in Forsyth County, and no one really cared. Over time, as the terror spread, the tactics of the midnight vigilantes evolved. Listen to this unbelievable account from Patrick Phillips' book. Joel Witt, a local man who was 23 in 1912, said that in the beginning, the night riders used gunfire and torches. But later, Witt recalled, quote, certain men would go to a black person's home with sticks tied up in a little bundle and leave them at the door, end quote. By late October, if you made such a thing and placed it outside the cabin of some last proud black farmer, by sunup, he and his whole family would be gone. This is like something out of a horror movie. While this may seem unbelievable to modern-day Americans, it's important to remember that night riders weren't really a new thing then. As far back as the 1700s, the state of Georgia sanctioned and deputized random white men to hunt down and capture runaway slaves. In the old law books, they simply called these groups patrols. Now, side note, not too long ago, I bought one of these old Georgia law books at an antique store in Atlanta. The book was printed in 1837, and the tan leather cover is crumbling and barely hanging on to this day. I've actually recorded a half-lick, that's a CATLICK mini-episode, where I read some of the horrifying laws that empowered these patrols and the tactics that they used. You can find that half-lick and all the others inside the CATLICK vault. Once the terrifying stories of these night raids spread throughout the black hamlets of Forsyth County, many families wasted no time. It was time to leave. Within days, caravans of horse-drawn wagons loaded down with personal possessions were streaming out of Forsyth County. Families fled to the north, south, east, and west, doing anything they could to escape the terror that would eventually find them if they stayed. So many black, threadbare families arrived in Gainesville and neighboring Hall County, one newspaper ran a story about it. Gainesville invaded. Hordes of Negroes have been arriving from Forsyth and neighboring counties who have been driven from their homes by indignant whites. No pity. No sympathy. Shocking, right? To me, this is one of those what the hell moments of American history that almost no one talks about. We're talking about wagon trains of actual American refugees on American soil, fleeing homegrown American terrorists and seeking asylum. These were people who left behind their homes, their belongings, their land, never to return. It's super messed up when you think about it. As the night riders wreaked havoc by night, life in Forsyth County hummed along as normal by day. A judge set a trial date for the prisoners being held down in Atlanta. The trial would be held during the first week of October. Of the 11 prisoners in Atlanta, 5 of them were released for lack of evidence. 4 of them would be charged with the assaults of either Ellen Grice or May Crow, and 2 others would be held as witnesses against those 4. Judge Newt Morris would preside over the trial. Fearful of another lynching, he personally drove to Atlanta to appeal to the governor for military protection throughout the duration of the trial. Governor Brown agreed, and he officially declared Forsyth County to be in a, quote, state of insurrection. He also declared martial law and dispatched 3 companies of the Georgia National Guard to protect the court proceedings and maintain order in the streets of Cumming. With the trial date set for October 3rd, the first order of business was transporting the 6 prisoners from downtown Atlanta back to Forsyth County. While this may seem like a simple task, it was anything but. With media coverage swirling, the 6 prisoners had become infamous around the state. The 40-mile journey to Forsyth could be treacherous and potentially fatal. A simple automobile escort could have been ambushed by mobs in any number of towns along the way. Because of this, the decision was made that the 3 companies of Georgia National Guardsmen would escort the prisoners north. So, on October the 2nd, Lieutenant Rucker McCarty arrives at the Fulton Tower. Traveling with him are 167 armed troops in full uniform. The prisoner transport had arrived. Their journey would not be a simple one. They'd have to travel by train 30 miles northeast to the little town of Buford, Georgia. From there, they'd have to march 13 miles northwest to Cumming. Remember, they had no train station. But before all that, they'd have to march from the Fulton Tower to Terminal Station, located a bit further into downtown Atlanta. And so, they began. Uniformed men marched in sync, perfectly straight columns of soldiers stretched all the way across the streets of Atlanta. The 6 prisoners were positioned for maximum protection at the center of the formation. A separate detachment of men surrounded them, individually assigned bodyguards, 1 for each black youth. They were there to protect them from any would-be assassins. The massive entourage totaled nearly 200 people once you accounted for journalists, lawyers, and other attendants traveling with the group. As the throng moved through the streets of Atlanta, onlookers emptied the shops and storefronts, jamming the sidewalks and hoping to catch a glimpse of the notorious prisoners. It was during this march when a photographer with the Atlanta Constitution pointed his camera at the black faces in the center of the formation and captured a provocative image. To be honest, in all my research, this is like the one photo that gets me. It's so damn heartbreaking, I want to cry every time I see it. The photo is black and white and pretty grainy, but I'll try to describe it for you. In the foreground, you see a few soldiers. Tall, strong-jawed white men in sharp uniforms, broad-rimmed hats, a rifle over one shoulder and a rolled-up tent over the other. Behind and around them, a dozen other soldiers dressed the same. And then, in the center of it all, 3 of the black prisoners. Jane Daniel, her brother Oscar, and Tony Howell. Jane and Oscar are walking side by side and standing so close their arms are touching. They're dressed as you'd expect, like the children of poor black country farmers. Oscar is wearing overalls and a black hat. Jane is wearing a very simple dress made of rough fabric that cascades down to her ankles. They both look scared as hell. Jane is looking down, brow furrowed, a face full of worry. And if you look close, you can see the metal around their wrists. Oscar's right wrist is handcuffed to Jane's left wrist. What's so sad is they just look like terrified kids, surrounded by guns and tall men towering over them on all sides. These were country kids with no education being paraded through the streets of downtown Atlanta. They likely had no knowledge of the criminal justice system, so they were probably confused by what was happening or what they were even being held for. And all the while, they're receiving icy, condemning stares from every white face along the way. These were deeply impoverished, powerless teenagers being treated like hardened criminals. There are a lot of failures of justice throughout this story, but this one just really pisses me off. The government failed, the justice system failed, the press failed, the people of Georgia failed, the entire system failed these teenagers. In 1912, the virus of white supremacy had so infected every living white soul in the state of Georgia, not one person that we know of had the courage or moral backbone to stand up and protect these kids. They had no one to advocate for them, no one willing to defend them, no one to empathize with their pain, no one to help them through the trauma they'd experienced. It's all incredibly sad. But as bad as things were during that forced march to the train station in Atlanta, when that circus arrived in Forsyth County, things were bound to get much worse. That's next time on CATLICK. CATLICK is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music and sound design by Duciel. Cover art by Rachel Eleanor. CATLICK store manager, Brett Harmon. CATLICK Instagram follower of the week, Julie Carter Pachinka. CATLICK Instagram commenter of the week, Joy Lanier. CATLICK Facebook Share Star of the Week, Jamie Hill. Big news, my friends. We've overhauled, refreshed, and upgraded the vault. You've subscribed, right? No? Listen, you're missing out in a major way. We've got a lot of CATLICK left to go, and I don't want you to miss out on all the extra bonuses, freebies, and behind-the-scenes content we've prepared for you inside the vault. It's a simple way to deep dive into the CATLICK storyline while also supporting the show. What are you waiting for? You could be browsing the archives minutes from now. Just go to catlick.com and click on Vault. That's catlick.com, click on Vault. And finally, CATLICK is independently written and produced by me, B.T. Harmon, signing off. I'd like to remind you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. We'll see you in the next episode.